So the Indigenous Scholar Colloquium and small group conversation meeting for Indigenous students with the scholar that happens immediately after the colloquium are an important part of the work of the Department of Psychology Indigenous Reconciliation Committee, and a way for students, faculty, and staff, as well as the broader community, to learn from Indigenous scholars and Indigenous knowledge holders and to build connections. We are grateful to the clinical science area for their support as a co-sponsor for today's event with invited speaker, Dr. Karlee Fellner, with opening by Elder Margaret. With so many participants in our Zoom, this non-webinar chosen format, to minimize distractions, you are invited to pin the speaker if they are not pinned already, and select speaker view rather than gallery view. And please keep your microphones and videos off until Q&A, when we will ask you to type questions into the chat. We are grateful to everyone for joining us today from many different time zones, territories, and nations. We have people signed in from Australia, from New Zealand, from south of the border. I myself am coming to this event from atop what is known as Burnaby Mountain, where I work and live, from where I will give a short introduction to the invited speaker for today's colloquium. Dr. Carly Felner is an associate professor at the University of Calgary in the Workland School of Education, specializing in counseling psychology and Indigenous education. She is Nehiao Igwa Otipismo Isqueo, Cree Métis, and completed her bachelor's in psychology and a master's degree in counseling psychology at the University of Alberta, and her PhD in counseling psychology at the University of British Columbia. In the registration information for this event, you were able to read about some of Dr. Fellner's many accomplishments, academic and community projects, including her work at the Maskihi Wellness Center, which she founded. With the center, she and her team provide counseling and therapy, consulting services, as well as cultural workshops. In addition to being an interesting scholar and counselor, she is also an amazing artist. Interestingly, I knew of her from the Métis community as the artist named Myote Esqueo before I learned in January that she was also the Dr. Karlee Fellner, scholar and psychologist, who had just finished as lead coordinator organizing this year's amazing offering and programming for the 2022 National Multicultural Conference and Summit. I could speak more about her work and her, but I expect, as is often done, she will also provide a self-introduction, which will help give important understanding to her work and what she will share with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rochelle. That was a beautiful introduction. I see you're wearing some of my artwork around your... I need to get one of those.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Thank you. Danse, everybody. Chante howaste wia miote esqueo netsigasan. Alberta otinia nia nehio neo otipem so esqueo. Oki ni stoni taniko katoyesaki. So, hi everybody. My names are Good-Hearted Women and Sweet Pine Woman. The name Good-Hearted Woman was given to me originally in the Dakota language at the Sundance that I'm a part of. And then my Blackfoot name, Sweet Pine Woman, was given to me in ceremony a few years ago in a lodge transfer. It's really good to be here with you all today. I am joining you today from Mohkinstsis, Calgary, Alberta, which rests on the traditional territories of the Siksikaitsitapi, the Blackfoot speaking people, my people's neighbors to the south, the Gaina, Piikani, Amskapi, Piikani, and Siksika nations, as well as the Stoney Nakoda people and the Tsuut'ina Dene people of the region. I myself grew up just outside of Edmonton in a small town called Devon, up on my people's territories, which are also territories that are shared by many other nations. My family was removed from Beaver Lake Cree Nation up by Lac La Biche through Métis scrip a couple of generations ago. And that scrip land was issued near Round Hill, Alberta, which is not too far from Camrose, which is where I was born. So I was born about 15 minutes away from where Nookham's scrip land was issued. And then my parents moved to Devon when I was a year old and started up a machine and welding shop there. So that's where I grew up. And then moved from there when I started my education in Edmonton. And then, as Rochelle mentioned, made my way over to the West Coast. So I lived there for a little bit. And my time there was very influential for me. So even a lot of what I share with you today was very influenced by my time there. That's where I first connected with one of my mentors, Alana Young Leon, who has been a really amazing and powerful cultural mentor. She's Anishinaabe and Cree from Manitoba, and has also been a really powerful clinical mentor. She's the one that introduced me to Indigenous focusing oriented therapy, which is an approach to therapy that has very much influenced the way that I work now. It's the greatest influence on the way that I work, I would say. And that was founded by Shirley Turcott, who's a Métis elder and knowledge holder who currently resides in Vancouver. So, and Alana resides in Vancouver as well. And I know that we have some Indigenous focusing oriented therapy folks who joined us here today also. So yeah, I'm just really grateful for that. My time on the coast was also really powerful for me because that is where I first really started attending ceremony and started learning cultural teachings formally, and really started, connecting and reconnecting with who I am as an Indigenous woman, growing up in small town Alberta. Both of my parents came from farm families, and that was very much, kind of the way that we grew up. They both left the farm to start my dad's company and do machining and welding. But oh, sorry. My phone's just going off randomly in the background. But yeah, it was, I wasn't raised formally with my cultural practices or with traditional ceremonies or with the Cree language or Michif language. And so I really started connecting with that actually when I was living in Vancouver. So I went there in 2010 to do my PhD. And then, it was kind of from there really got into attending different ceremonies and cultural events and helping and just learning the power of our ways. And so my work is really a combination of Indigenous focusing oriented therapy and what I've learned, as a helper and participant with ceremony, as well as the work of Eduardo Duran, who's been a tremendous influence on me with his work, which some of you may be familiar with. He's written a number of incredible books, one of them being Healing the Soul Wound, which really addresses, counseling from an Indigenous perspective. So all of these together and all of my phenomenal elders and mentors have really influenced my work. And what I share with you today comes, is this knowledge and these teachings of these wonderful people. I also completed my doctoral internship at the Indian Health Board of Minneapolis out in Minnesota. And I didn't know anybody there when I matched there through the APIC system. And it was really nerve-wracking, but it ended up being, to this day, one of the best years of my life. And I have a lot of teachers there, a lot of mentors there who I'll be, mentioning as I share with you today, because their teachings have really influenced, again, the way that I approach clinical work as well as research and my teaching as well. So in everything I do, I really try to approach as much as I'm able to from a decolonizing perspective, you know, and really returning to our Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing, because they are incredibly powerful. And not only for Indigenous people, but for, you know, I would say all people of the world, because our teachings are grounded in land. They're based in land, and we are all land. Our bodies are made of land. Our bodies are made of water. As human beings, we're inseparable from the land and from the water. And so these teachings are really human teachings. And I've had the opportunity to connect with Indigenous peoples from across the world, you know, from Africa, Australia, New Zealand, from obviously the States, and from Central and South America, as they're known today. Our teachings are so similar. They're so beautiful, and they carry so much wisdom that the world needs right now with what we're dealing with. As a result of the ways that we've been living through, you know, colonialism and capitalism and things like that. So without further ado, I'll just get started sharing a story with you today. That's how I'm going to ground this work, and how I'm going to start this work is through story. And this is a story that came to me actually when I was experiencing a bout of writer's block, which always ends up in something kind of exciting when I take that time to reflect. And so I was writing a chapter for a book on Indigenous education about addressing trauma in the classroom. And I was having a really, really hard time writing it, because a lot of these ideas, which I'll share with you today, are very controversial, no matter what angle you're coming at it from, you know, whether it's Western psychology or community, you know, our Indigenous communities. Some of these ideas are really challenging. And I wanted to be sure to do it in a good way. And so I was having a really hard time writing about these ideas. And as I do, you know, I just kind of stepped away from it, and I said some prayers and took some time just to connect, you know, that way. And this story came through. And so I'll share this story with you. And it's a story that helps us begin to shift into this understanding of trauma wisdom and survivance, and into decolonizing, you know, the ways that we approach our work, especially in the field of psychology, but more broadly as well. So this story is about a young woman. Her name is iskotew, which is the Cree word for fire. So iskotew has had this crow that's been bothering her for as long as she can remember. This crow is like around her all during the day and all during the night, and it wakes her up in the middle of the night at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. Caw, caw! This crow will come, and it's just bothering her. It's been with her as long as she can remember. She can't remember a time that it hasn't been with her. It's interfered with her school. It's interfered with her work. It interferes with the relationships and even with her family. So she'll be sitting down for dinner at night, and, you know, she's sitting with her family, and all of a sudden there's this crow again, caw, 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 and it's flying around and it's bothering everybody. It's flapping its wings, it's cawing, it's pecking, and nobody can stand it. You know, her family can't stand it. Her coworkers can't stand it. The people she went to school with can't stand it. And everybody's tried different ways of getting rid of this crow or dealing with this crow. You know, some people have yelled at it and told it to get away. They take a broom and try to get it away from them and, you know, get out of here, chase it outside. Doesn't work, keeps coming back. Sometimes some people, including her, have tried to ignore it, right? I'm just going to shut the crow out. I'm going to plug my ears. I'm going to put my headphones on, go in my blanket, you know, or people try not to look at it. They try not to give it attention. Maybe it'll go away then, but it doesn't. It just keeps coming back. Caw, 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 and pecking and pecking and pecking. And so, you know, some people look at iskotew and they think, you know, that poor crow woman, she's just, oh, it's just terrible what she has to deal with. It's terrible that she has that crow with her all the time. And they really feel pity for her. They really feel sad for her. Other people, you know, their reaction to iskotew is that like, what's wrong with her? What is wrong with that crow woman? She can't get it together. She can't deal with this crow or get rid of this crow. She's always dragging it around everywhere with her. What's wrong with her? You know, people are having all these different reactions, but everybody has one thing in common, and it's that they hate this crow. They cannot stand this crow, and iskotew definitely cannot stand this crow. And so she's tried everything that she can to get rid of it. You know, she even tried going to Dr. Crow Whisperer once and had this conversation with Dr. Crow Whisperer. Can you please help me with this crow? And sure enough, you know, Dr. Crow Whisperer, she was able to have some conversations with the crow, to get the crow to kind of quiet down a little bit, be a little bit less obnoxious, give iskotew a few nights of good rest and sleep where she didn't have to wake up at 3 a.m. And so she was able to help a little bit in that way. You know, she was able to kind of help the crow settle a little bit. But at the end of the day, the crow just kept coming back, kept squawking and cawing and pecking, and iskotew couldn't stand it. She wants the crow gone, like 100% gone. And so, you know, iskotew kind of comes to the end of her rope with this crow. And so she decides one day, I'm just going to go see Dr. Coyote. Like, I give up. I'm going to go see this guy. I heard that he can really help when things get too desperate. And so she goes in and sees Dr. Coyote and tells him what's been going on, and you know, that this crow's been bothering her for as long as she can remember. She doesn't even know how long it's been there. And Dr. Coyote just cuts her off and says, oh, don't worry. Don't worry. I've got something for you. And Dr. Coyote gets this big grin on his face, and he hands her a little bottle of pills. And he says, here you go. This is what you need. This will help you. And so she takes this bottle of pills and she looks at it, and she's not, you know, she's kind of feeling unsure. She sees on there, you know, there's this teeny tiny little font that says possible side effects may include, right? And there's a whole bunch of things listed there, you know, things like numbness and complacency, and just that, you know, things are going to get quiet in the world, and just all of this stuff, you know. And so she's not too keen on the side effects, but she's really not keen on this crow. And so she just decides, you know what, to heck with it. I'm going to give this a try because I've tried everything else. I can't get rid of this dang thing. So iskotew starts to take Dr. Coyote's pills. And sure enough, it actually really does help block out that crow. It's almost like, I don't know, it's almost like it creates like a bubble or something. There's some sort of like protection there or something from that crow, except that it's coming from within. It's not outside. And so she starts to notice that, yeah, you know, she's not noticing the crow as much. It's still there. She's not hearing it. She's not really feeling it. Like, even when it pecks her, her skin doesn't feel it as much. But also she's noticing that she's not hearing a lot of other things as well. She's not seeing a lot of other things as well. She's not feeling a lot of other things as well. So it's not just the crow. It's not just the crow that's quieter. It's not just the crow that's muted. It's kind of like everything is. Even the colors in the world, they got a bit more dull. And so, you know, Dr. Coyote's medicine is working, but it's also blocking out a lot of other things. And so she doesn't really like that, but hey, at least the crow is not bothering her. So she carries on with Dr. Coyote's pills for quite some time. And then at some point, and she doesn't quite know when, she starts to notice the crow again. She starts to feel the pecks a bit more. She starts to hear the cawing again. And she's like, what's going on here? What's, you know, she can hear the caw, caw. It's not as obnoxious, but it's coming back. And eventually, even though she's still taking Dr. Coyote's medication, it just gets louder and louder and louder to the point where it's pretty much the same way it was before. And there's that crow again, caw, 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 and pecking and bothering her. And her family, you know, they still notice it anyways. It's still around. Everybody else still feels it, sees it, hears it. And so iskotew just tosses the pills in the trash. She's like, I'm done with that. That's not, forget it, right? I'd rather just experience the world. If this crow is going to be around anyway, it's still around my family, it's still around my friends. Oh, well. So, you know, she's there with that crow and she's starting to feel really, really helpless, just really desperate, really exhausted, really over it. And so one night, you know, she's just feeling so defeated, so helpless. It's like little psychology reference for, it's like the dogs, you know, the learned helplessness dogs that just lay on the shock pad. She got to that point. And so, you know, she one night decides she just gives up. She's done. She's tried everything. She's tried reasoning with the crow. She's tried yelling at it, getting it to go away, ignoring it, taking the pills, the crow whisperer, everything. And so she just finally comes to a point where she gives up. She's done. She can't do it anymore. She can't live like this anymore. She is finished. And so Iskotew gets up that day and she goes outside and she just starts walking. She's on the sidewalk and she's walking and walking and walking and walking and walking. And she's just walking. She doesn't have anywhere that she's going in particular. She's just done. She's given up on life. She's done. And she's walking and walking and walking, walking and walking and walking on the pavement, walking and walking. And as she's walking, at some point that pavement disappears and she's walking on the land. And she's walking and walking and walking. She's walking on the earth, walking and walking and walking and walking. And she's walking and 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 walking. And she just keeps walking and walking and walking and walking for so long. It's like, it's as long as a person could ever humanly walk. She's walking and walking and walking. Walking for days and nights. The sun and the moon are just going and going, and she's walking and walking. And then one day, the sun is out. There's some clouds in the sky, but the sky is blue. And she's walking and walking and walking, and she suddenly comes across this clearing that she decides to take a rest in, finally, after walking and walking and walking for moons and moons and moons. And so she goes to that clearing, and it's just in the trees. There's all trees all around. And she goes and she just lays in the grass. She lays on the ground. There's leaves on the ground beside her. The grass is bright and green. It's like summertime, you know, and there's insects all around, and she can hear them. She can hear birds singing. She can hear the wind rustling the leaves and moving through the grass and the branches. And all of a sudden, she notices that she doesn't hear the crow. For the first time in her life, she is not noticing the crow. Because even when she was taking those pills, it was still around all the time. But all of a sudden, there's just no crow. This is the first time she's noticed the sound of the birds, the sound of the wind, the sound of the insects. And she's lying there and just lets out a big breath. She's looking up at the sky and the clouds, and she has tears forming in her eyes. She can't believe what's happening right now. And then all of a sudden she hears this caw, caw, this crow. It's back. And she sits up, and it's right in front of her on the ground, and it hops over, little crow hops onto her foot. And the crow says, "Danse, Iskotew, how are you?" And she looks at the crow. Her eyes just open up like, what is going on? And this crow is looking at her, smiling, asking her how she's doing, and she just starts laughing. Because this thing that she's hated her whole life, this crow, it's like it's talking to her now, and she can understand. And so she's just laughing at the absurdity of this whole thing and this whole lifetime. And she doesn't even know why she's laughing, but it's just coming out. And she's laughing and laughing, and her whole body is shaking. It's that kind of laughter. Her stomach is hurting. Her eyes are just running with tears. All these tears are coming out in laughter. And Crow is just standing there on her foot, smiling, grinning. And all of the land around her, the insects, the birds, they're all laughing with her. The whole land is like shaking with that laughter. And she's just like laughing and laughing, and the tears are coming. And it's as she's laughing, all of that stress, all of that tension, all of that hatred for this crow is just melting off her body. It's shaking off of her body into the land. She can feel that a whole lifetime and then some of hating this crow and not wanting this crow is going into the land, laughing into the land. It's releasing into the wind. The wind is taking that. The land is taking it. And she just keeps laughing and laughing. The crow is just smiling while everybody else laughs with her. And she just keeps laughing and laughing and laughing. Her stomach is hurting so much. And finally, she starts to catch her breath a bit, and the laughter starts to slow. You know, she's taking those deep breaths, you know, and the laughter kind of gets less and less and less, and the laughter's slowing down, and she's wiping her eyes, wiping the tears out of her eyes. And, you know, and she looks at that crow and shakes her head, and she just says, "What?" Like, what? And the crow just looks at her again and says, "Tanse." I said, "How are you?" And she says, what's happening right now? What, like, you're speaking to me and I can understand you. What's happening? What is this? What's going on? And Crow says, "Well, I've been trying to get your attention, like, for a really, really long time." And she says, "What? Like, I don't get it." "Well, yeah, that's why I've been pecking at you and cawing and clawing and all these things. It's, you know, I was trying to get your attention, iskotew. I was trying to talk to you here, and you're just ignoring me all the time, or trying to get rid of me, or, you know, I was trying to have a conversation with you." Iskotew just shakes her head. She can't even believe what's going on right now. And she says, "Okay, that this doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever, but I can understand you. So the floor is yours." And so Crow just smiles, and he said, "You know, I've been trying to get your attention for a long time. And even before you came in, I was trying to get the attention of your parents, your grandparents. I've been around for a long time. You know, I don't like this cawing and pecking either. Like, it's a lot of work. So I'm glad we finally get to talk." He said, "You know, myself and our other relatives here, our other animal relatives, we've been trying to get your attention, the attention of the two-leggeds, for a long time. And we're still trying to get your attention." Crow said, "Somewhere between the slot machines and Facebook and cell phones and concrete, you've all lost your way. You're losing your way. You're forgetting your original instructions and your teachings. And we're trying to get your attention. We're trying to talk to you about this because there's a better way. You know, we need to come back into balance. Things are out of balance right now." Crow says, "You're not following your natural laws." And iskotew takes a moment and kind of shakes her head and thinks about it. And she knows the crow's right. You know, she knows that everyday natural law is being violated in these different ways, right? Those original teachings, those teachings that tell us how to live in a good way with each other as human beings, but also how to live in a good way with our relatives, the animals, the plants, the water, the air, you know, all of our relatives of the universe. And so she knows Crow is right. And Crow says, "You know, that's the only reason I've been trying to come. I've been trying to tell you, you know, and all of us are trying to help all of you two-leggeds, every single one of you. It's not just you." And he says, "So I have something that I want you to do." And she says, "Okay," you know, kind of a little bit unsure again, and concerned about what the ask is going to be. But he asks her to put out her hand. So iskotew puts out her hand, and the crow puts 7 little grains of tobacco in her hand. And crow says, these are your teachings in these tobacco, and I want you to take these back to your people, back to the two-leggeds, and to share them. And she, you know, kind of scratches her head and shakes her head, and she's like, I can't do that. I don't know this. I don't know my teachings. I don't know natural law. I don't know what that is, you know. And crow says, you're gonna know. Just trust us, trust yourself. You're gonna know, and we're gonna be here to help you. All of your relatives will be here to help you. We need you to do this. So again, iskotew, you know, she looks down at that tobacco in her hand and just like, shakes her head. She's feeling really unsure, like, I can't do this. I don't know anything. I don't know anything. I don't have teachings. Who am I? You know, I'm crow woman. I'm this one that's been, you know, people have shut out of their lives for years and years. And so she just looks at that tobacco and she's just, I can't do this. This isn't for me. And crow just looks at her again, and crow says, you can do this, and you need to do this. We need you to do this, and your people need you to do this. Iskotew felt that one. It got in, and she felt it in her heart. She's still unsure of herself. You know, that human side of her, that ego side, is really unsure and still feels like, okay, I don't know. But she decides to trust the crow, and she says, okay, I'll trust you on this. I'll take these tobacco grains and I'll do my best, whatever that is. She has no idea what's being asked of her, right? So she puts that tobacco, she wraps it up in a little piece of tissue in her pocket, puts it in her pocket. And crow says, thank you. He says, we'll be here anytime you need us. Just call on us. We're here to help you. That's what we've been trying to do. That's what I've been trying to do. And so iskotew, she understands that now. She smiles at the crow and nods her head, still in disbelief that this just happened. Still in disbelief that she now actually likes this crow that she's hated her whole life. But really happy about it, really feeling for the first time in her life a sense of peacefulness, content, harmony, and balance. Very unsure, so many unknowns, but she feels good. So she's just going to trust it and go with it. And so crow says, all right, I'm going to take off now. I got other stuff to do. You've really been working me hard these past years and years. So crow takes off, and iskotew decides to take a bit of time there on the land. She lays down again, you know, just kind of takes it all in, thinks about what happened, just processes the fact that this thing she's hated for so long was actually trying to help her. It's a total shift, a full shift. And so she takes some time there in the land for a while. She relaxes, she rests, she stays there for a few moons. And then when she feels ready, she gets up and she starts walking back. And walking and walking and walking. And she walks and walks and walks and walks and walks and walks until that pavement is under her feet again. And when the pavement's under her feet and she's back, you know, around the other two-leggeds, around people again, back in the city, back in the town that she's from, she looks around her and everything's so much more clear. You know, she sees an elderly woman over there with a coyote nipping at her heels, and that elderly woman's trying to kick the coyote off and get the coyote off and push it off. She sees a man over there and he has a big raven that's flapping by his head, and that man's trying to punch the raven away and get it away, yelling at it. And she sees, you know, she looks around and she sees all of these helpers that are trying to get the attention of her human relatives. And in that moment, iskotew, seeing this with her people, she's filled with compassion. She's filled with love for her people, because she realizes, you know, that, wow, like we're all just struggling. We're suffering so much. And here's these helpers trying to help us. And so she's filled with that compassion and with that love. And she knows that's that first grain of tobacco. And so she takes the tobacco out, unwraps it, takes that first grain, and she goes and finds one of those trees that's growing up, they planted it in the pavement and she puts that tobacco down by that tree, that first teaching, Sagitowin, love. And she goes forward to help her people. And so that's the end of the story, but the beginning of the story also. And this story, the story of iskotew, is the story of our relationship with trauma, our relationship with anxiety, with depression, with whatever it is that we're struggling with, whatever it is that we've named it. One of the most powerful teachings that I've received in learning Indigenous focusing oriented therapy from Shirley Turcott and her helpers and her team is that whatever we're experiencing, whatever, what gets labeled as a symptom or labeled as a problem, and this applies to anything, right? It can be sadness, it can be heartburn, it can be diabetes, it can be anger, right? Anything like this. We've learned from a colonial perspective to pathologize that. The colonized world, Euro-Western psychology and Euro-Western medicine has taught us that these things are bad, that they're no good, right? If I feel grief, it's no good. If I'm angry, it's no good. If I feel depressed, it's no good. If I have a stomach ulcer, it's no good, right? This is what we learn and we internalize. But what I've learned through Indigenous focusing oriented therapy is to understand that whatever that is that we're experiencing is a conversation. It's a conversation that's coming up through our body and that has guidance for us. It has information for us. It has a message for us. And those messages, just like what the crow is trying to bring to iskotew, those messages aren't just for me as an individual, but they're for our whole network of relationships. One of the key differences between Indigenous psychology and Euro-Western psychology is that there is no such thing as an individual in isolation from an Indigenous perspective. From a Euro-Western perspective, we look at somebody and we see this individual. We see that person's neurobiology, that person's pathology, that person's deficit, right? All that focus on negative and deficit and pathology. From an Indigenous perspective, we understand that we never exist as individuals, that at every moment of every day and every night, I exist in relation to all of my relatives. Each and every single one of us are interconnected with our families, with our communities, with our nations, with society as a whole, with the land and the water, with our animal relatives, and with the greater cosmos as well, in the whole metaphysical world, whatever it is that you believe in, right? Whether that's energies or spirits or ancestors, it doesn't matter. But it's this understanding that each of us are a collective self, that we are always in relation, and that we are also in relation at all times to generations past and future. Many of our teachings, depending what nation you come from, but the teachings that have been shared with me is that it's 7 generations in the future and 7 generations in the past that are directly connected to us, right? So that crow that's coming, whatever that may be, that crow can be coming from 5 generations ago, from 7 generations in the future, from anywhere in that whole network and universe of relationships. It's almost like, each of us are like a sun with all these planets orbiting around us. Like we're always in these relationships that are moving around us and that impact us and that we impact, right? So we see that a lot of even the physical illnesses that we experience today are connected to land, right? And what's happening to the land. One of the tricks of Euro-Western ideologies has again been to convince us that we're disconnected from the land, that we're somehow superior to it, that we have dominion over it, like all of these words that are very colonial, right? And very much about power and control and ego. But the reality is that we are actually humbled to the land, right? It's the land that keeps us alive. Every single one of us is comprised of land. We cannot physically exist without water and without the plants and the animals. And so, you know, those relationships are very powerful and they're very real and they impact us. And so bringing it back to a psychology perspective, when we have somebody who comes to see us for help, and I do not use the word clients, and I certainly do not use the word patients. One of the teachings that I've really taken in is how words have spirit. They do. And so that word patient, that word client, those come with spirit attached to them. And so I've learned a couple of different things. You know, one of my elders from the Indian Health Board of Minneapolis, Wisug, Richard Wright, he's Leech Lake Ojibwe. He taught me, you know, because I was having this conversation with him, to use the word Manitou, which is the word for spirit, you know, that when someone comes to see us, we acknowledge them as Manitou, which is the same as what we are. That person is Manitou, I am Manitou, we're on the same level, right? Another word that was shared with me recently when I was working in community was the Cree word okeokeo, which means guest. So even to think of those who come to us for help as guests, and to see myself as an oskapeos, right, as a helper in that situation, but to begin to change that language. So when someone comes to see me, an okeokeo, a guest, or a manitou, a spirit, comes to see me for help in that way, I understand that that person coming in is a universe of relationships, that whatever they're coming in with, whatever they share with me about their story, whatever's going on with them, whatever traumas it might be, or depression or anxiety or whatever it is, I understand that that is a part of that whole web of relationships. And I also understand that that person is not messed up. One of the things that Euro-Western psychology has convinced us is that we are messed up and there is something wrong with us if we're experiencing difficulty and struggle. And that couldn't be further from the truth. It's human, right? Like as human beings, we have to deal with sickness. We have to deal with death. There are these inevitabilities of life that we understand through Indigenous teachings, right? This, the dynamics, and these teachings are in so many cultures in the world, right? The dynamics of life and death, and that chaos destructive force, and that life-giving, nurturing force, right? These are always in flux and flow and in relationship. And so we understand from Indigenous perspectives that struggle and difficulty is normal. It's not abnormal. It's not a deficit. And yes, we can get to a point where we are suffering so much, just like iskotew was. But again, that doesn't mean that we're messed up. And so working from an Indigenous perspective in Indigenous psychology, it's understanding that person coming in is basically well, that they are basically well, and that whatever it is that they're experiencing is just something that's getting the best of them. And again, another teaching that came from Richard, my mentor and elder, is he had this term, you know, in their dialect of Anishinaabe-Mowin, and the term is Niji Mowin Miwin Ja. And he said that translates to this thing that's bothering you, that's getting the best of you. So whatever it is, we understand that that person, that spirit, they are basically well and healthy, but there's something that's getting the best of them in this moment. And so that's what we're there to support. And the way that I understand my role, you know, coming through an Indigenous perspective, is that I just see myself as someone who is there to facilitate that person opening up to their medicines. Because the reality is that each of us have the medicines that we need to heal. And on a grander scale, talking about our Indigenous communities, each of our communities have what they need to heal and know what they need to heal. There's so much medicine in our communities. And this is where it's really powerful to begin to shift the terminology that we use to get out of that trauma narrative. Because one of the things that colonialism has done so well has created these deficit narratives, right? And so even something like the term intergenerational trauma, yes, it's an important concept for us to understand. We need to have that perspective and that understanding. And we also need to shift and to acknowledge intergenerational survivance. I remember one time, there was this it was an Indigenous news source. And that Indigenous news source had an article that was about 500 years of trauma being in the DNA of Indigenous people. And when I saw that, I was so upset because you, as an Indigenous person, you see that title, you read that title, that you have 500 years of trauma in your DNA. And it's basically a message, you are screwed, right? Like you are effed up, you're done. Because like, whoa, that's a lot, right? And for people who are not Indigenous, they see that, they hear that, and they're like, whoa, Indigenous people are messed up, right? And that's the narrative that's told about us and told about our communities. What needs to happen is that acknowledgement, that shift, that understanding that we have over 500 years of surviving attempted genocide in our DNA. We are not supposed to be here, and we are still. There were many attempts made to exterminate us and to eliminate us, and here we are. We are still alive. And so we actually have all of that survivance in our blood. Everything our ancestors did to survive is in us, and we carry that medicine. And not only that, but we carry the medicine of the many countless generations before, since time immemorial, of our people living in and with the land. For those of you that have experienced, Alberta winters as an example, speaking to my context, it's like, I think about my ancestors and I'm like, I do not know how you did it. Like, I could not survive -40 on the prairies in the winter. And similarly, wherever your people are from, right? It's incredible, the wisdom, the knowledge that our ancestors had to survive with and on the land. And so we're also not only existing in response to colonialism, we existed for thousands of years before colonialism happened, and all of that wisdom is in us and with us. And so colonialism is just like this little blip on the Indigenous timeline, a really terrible blip, right? Like it's done a lot of damage, it's wreaked a lot of havoc, it's taken a lot of life. And acknowledging that pain, acknowledging that difficulty, acknowledging that trauma is very, very important. That needs to be acknowledged too. And at the same time, we also need to acknowledge all of the rest of what we are and who we are, right? We are all of this knowledge and all of this medicine. And so, just an example is to know that originally, right, like our teachings, our knowledges, our languages, our songs, they came from the land. And so for those of us like myself, who I don't speak my language, I'm trying to learn, and I will continue doing my best to learn throughout my life, but also not to see that as a deficit, right? And to know that the land still holds all this knowledge. And so, sometimes again, you hear these narratives that, oh, we've lost these songs, we've lost these ceremonies. First off, it's not lost. That's one of the things that I've learned from my mentors as well. They were stolen. They were taken from us violently, right? But also they're not gone. They're still with the land. And sometimes we receive these things still. People receive songs, when they're in prayer or meditation or ceremony. People receive ceremonies still. And one of the things I've been taught by my mentors is that our cultures were always evolving. They always have. They always had to shift. And we hear different nations and peoples who had great migrations, right, that really shifted the cultural practices and the ceremonies. And this was prior to colonialism. And so it's acknowledging that that continues to happen still today, that we continue to receive, you know, new songs, new ceremonies, new knowledges that I wouldn't even say are necessarily new, right? We don't know. Maybe they existed thousands of years ago and those were gone for a period of time and now they're coming back. We don't know, but the beautiful thing from an Indigenous perspective is we don't need to know. That need to know is very much a part of a Euro-Western colonial framework. And, you know, when I'm working with my students and teaching about Indigenous psychology and even just like working with various cultures, you know, which all of us are so different. There can't be these sweeping generalizations made about any culture, right? Including the dominating colonial culture. There's so much diversity within that too. And we see that in psychology, right? Like great discrepancies between different theoretical orientations that invalidate each other or whatever, right? But one of the things that I share with my students is that, again, another great lie we've been told in psychology is that we need to know, that we need to be an expert. And I just completely disagree. Through our Indigenous teachings, we understand that not knowing is a very powerful place to be, that humility is the starting point to medicine. Medicine being what, you know, whatever it is we have to share or access to, that helps us to be in balance and wellness. And so, you know, all of this to say that when we experience these difficulties, when we experience, you know, trauma triggers, when we experience deep grief, when we experience anger, whatever, anything that's bothering us, that's getting the best of us, addiction, you know, anything, you name it, physical illnesses even too, right? All of these are a call to wellness. All of these are a call to medicine. They are a crow that is trying to get our attention, saying something is out of balance right now. Something is out of harmony. And so, you know, there's this really awesome introductory video on YouTube that I highly recommend, take note, by Shirley Turcott, the founder of Indigenous Focusing Oriented Therapy. So it's on her Shirley Turcott account. And the name of that video is Aboriginal Psychotherapy. And she posted it back in 2012. But in there, she even makes reference to, you know, how she continues to be triggered, right, in regard to certain things. And of all the people I've met in my life, she's done, you know, the most trauma work, right? But she continues to have those triggers. And she says that's because these things are still happening, right? So if I'm abused as a child, I can do all my healing work. I can do incredible trauma work and everything holistically to address that. But I'm still going to get triggered until there is no more child abuse in the world. When child abuse is eliminated, we no longer need those triggers. But until it is eliminated, we still need that because it's information that's saying this needs to change. You need to change how you're living with each other because we're not living with natural law. And so all of this is about those shifts to balance. And so what can we do? And I'm very mindful of the time. We only have a couple minutes left before we move into the small group discussion afterwards. But what we can do is when something's coming up for us, when something's bothering us and getting the best of us, is creating that space, just as iskotew did, right? Going to the land. And her giving up and going to the land, that could be many things, right? Like it could be literally going to the land. It could have been a suicide attempt that she survived. It could have been some kind of rock bottom, right? Who knows what it is? It doesn't matter, but it was her being done with it, learned helplessness, finished over it, like she's given up completely. And getting to that point, you know, but then with whatever it was that happened for her, she ended up having that space, that quiet. And so however we do that, to take that time and to open up and to hear that crow when we're experiencing it and to say, what do you need? What's the medicine that you need right now? And our greatest learning is to trust that, right? It's really this process again of decolonizing, which I didn't even define what that term means to me, and I'm not going to because we don't have time, but it's really that undoing, right? The undoing of these colonial ways of thinking, and that colonialism has taught us to doubt ourselves, right? That if I'm experiencing grief and I ask, what's the medicine that you need? And it's suddenly like, oh, you need to put out a food offering because there's hungry ancestors that have gone on. I trust that. That's decolonizing, right? Is to trust that knowledge rather than have that colonial mind come in and say, oh no, you don't know what you're talking about. That's not real, right? Don't worry about that. So, but we all have that medicine. And when we open to it, it will show us if there's a certain place we need to go, if we need to put our hands in the river or in the land, and just give that to land and know that whatever it is we're experiencing, the land can take it and will take it and will help transform it and heal it. We know that we give off carbon dioxide when we release things verbally, and those trees take that in and they purify it into oxygen. They create life out of that, right? We know this. The land is always balancing. It's because it follows natural law. It's always in harmony. We saw that at the beginning of the pandemic. The dolphins coming back, right, to the harbors by Venice, like the ways that the land just is always repairing, it's always healing. And so it can help us when we need to release those things. Anyway, I'm very aware of the time. This is a very deep and broad topic. There's much more to be said. I do have other resources and stuff online, other writing online, even my dissertation, I actually highly recommend because it's not in a book form yet, but you can look it up on the UBC Circle website. It's available freely to anybody who wants to look at it. And it's just, there's some amazing wisdom in there from 16 different knowledge holders who shared, about Indigenous wellness, mental health, but mental health is wellness, holistic wellness. So yeah, I think I'll stop myself there because I really could keep going forever, but I want to respect our plans today.
Really just so grateful for your sharing. There's just so much there and so much more. Next up, I would like to ask Todd Nelson to say a few words on behalf of the Indigenous Reconciliation Committee.
Hi, everyone. My name is Todd Nelson. I am an SFU undergraduate student studying behavioral neuroscience and a student representative on the Indigenous Reconciliation Committee. I am also a member of Spuzin First Nation. With that brief introduction, I'd like to offer my deepest thanks to Dr. Fellner. Thank you so much, Dr. Fellner, for that amazing talk and for sharing your knowledge with us today. To thank you, we would like to present you with a scarf. I hope you can see it. This scarf is made by Lisa Shepard, a Métis artist. The scarf is called Rendezvous at the Crossing. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Fellner.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Fellner, and thank you, Todd, for presenting the scarf on our behalf. Now we have a few minutes for questions before we end around 1:50, 1:55. We'll open up the chat now, where we ask that you put your question in the chat. You could also write your name phonetically to help with the pronunciation. We'll use the chat to work through some of the questions. Shireen Balanji, another student member of the IRC, will help identify questions and read them to the group. So we can do that. If there are some people want to do questions, or if you can also put in your thanks, your appreciation, perhaps where you're from. Oh, just as a sharing of the 230 people or so that were registered, around 40% identify as Indigenous, and another 10% identify as having a family member who is Indigenous. So we are very thankful for everybody for joining us. And it shows that when we create spaces like this, we can all come together and do more learning.
We have one question from Kimberly, and she's asking, I'd never considered shifting triggers to lessons. How do you help your guests adopt this shift?
Yeah, so it's really like in the approach to therapy. So it's, you know, I do share a lot of what I've shared with you today about how whatever it is that's coming through your body is a conversation. It's an intergenerational and collective conversation that's coming through you and that's asking for medicine. So I'll explicitly share that with them. And then when I'm, you know, in that moment doing the therapeutic work, and that's where, you know, like Indigenous focusing oriented therapy comes in, which I also highly recommend everyone to check out. It's always hard to get into the training, but anyway, it's worth looking into. And I do little workshops here and there through Muskiki Wellness that incorporate that. So you can also follow my webpage if you want. I do virtual workshops and stuff too. I can type it into the chat, but what I do when I'm doing the therapeutic work is then there in the moment, you know, whatever's coming up from that person, let's just say anxiety, right? There's a lot of different ways to work through it that get more specifically into the therapeutic techniques, but it's asking, ultimately, what we're getting around to is asking into what is that anxiety asking for, right? And so we might connect with whose anxiety is that. And so one of the things that we do from an Indigenous focusing perspective is we can unpack, right? So we actually, again, there's tons of different techniques for this, but we can unpack the anxiety, see how much is mine, how much belongs to my parents, how much belongs to my family, how much of this is society, how much of this is, you know, the damage that's being done to the earth right now, how much of this is the pandemic, right? Like this anxiety that's shared by all of humanity because we're so collective. And so, you know, it's just tapping into, there's so much to it, but I think one of the most powerful ways that the work works is through the fact that I embody that shift myself, right? And even though I still struggle with it, and I always will, like with undoing that deficit narrative, because even for myself, you know, I'll get, especially since becoming a mom, I have a 1.5-year-old, it's a challenge. Like I'll get mad, right? I'll feel angry. And I still have that colonial default of like, oh my God, what's wrong with me? Why am I mad? You know, what's my problem? So then I have to like take that time, remind myself, because it's a lot to undo. It's a whole lifetime of programming, right? But I bring that very much into my work with people. And so they have that sense, and I share with them, there's nothing wrong with you, right? This is all guiding you to your medicine. And so ultimately we're just asking into what is the medicine that they need. And what I'm doing is helping support and validate whatever medicines come up for them, because I know that they know their medicine best. I am not the expert, you know, they have that. And so I might have it in my mind of like, oh, you know, it might help if you go put an offering out here, or if you go scream into the land or whatever, but it's whatever comes up for them of like, oh, I just need to like, you know, go out by the river and just put my hands in the river. And it's like, great, you do that, right? Follow your body, follow that wisdom. And we don't even need to know where this issue is coming from or what, you know, we don't have to know those specifics from an Indigenous perspective. We can just trust the process and the healing. So I really hope that answers your question. It's like, this is where we could get into like some fun for a much longer workshop for a few weeks.
Of course, and there's lots of interest in the chat for the workshops you were mentioning. And Rochelle also mentioned that she will be posting all the links and references mentioned on the IRC website. So don't worry too much about that. And the recording will also be circulated.
Awesome.
We do have one question about language in the land. They're asking, I also heard an elder say that the languages are within us and we must reawaken it. How do you feel about this? The elder also said it's so important to use terms like reawaken rather than facing extinction.
I just got goosebumps. I love that. I love that. And I couldn't agree more because, you know, going back to what I shared, we are the land and the land is us. Like we are not separable. We are inseparable. That's the word. And so I completely agree with your elder, right? Like it's in our DNA. And it's in relation in this whole web of relationships. And so I very much believe in that. I believe that we have incredible ancestral knowledges and wisdoms and languages within ourselves. And I completely agree with the reawaken. I mean, I love that because it's like, yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. You gave me goosebumps.
Wonderful. And we have a lot of questions flooding in now. But so here's one from Christina Cruz. It says, Tansy, Dr. Fellner, such a good feeling being here with everyone. When bridging with non-Indigenous medical providers, how do you help to explain interconnectivity for wellness when asking what the diagnosis/problem is to treat?
Okay, can you read that last part again?
Of course.
Sorry. I'm like, one more time.
1 second. When bridging with non-Indigenous medical providers, how do you help to explain the interconnectivity for wellness when asked what the diagnosis or problem is that needs to be treated? So basically, how do you help when they want to label it, I think is what they're trying to get at.
Thanks, Christina. Dr. Cruz gives me the hardest question. I know her. No, that's a really good question, though. It brings me back to my internship days because particularly in the US, this is it's a big thing, right? Like at my internship, I had to diagnose every single person I saw for them to be able to receive services, right? Like it was very real. And I remember my first day of internship, it was just, you know, like everybody else just knew that that was a given. And at some point I had this realization that like, and I said it out loud, are you saying I have to diagnose everyone I work with? And they looked at me like in disbelief that I was shocked. But I'm like, okay, this is a Canada-US difference here. And so I had to do that a lot. And here I go giving away some of my tricks. No, this is what I call Coyote Psychology. And so I understand that as kind of, you know, embodying that energy of like the transformer and like trickster within the system, where there is this reality that we have to work with these colonial systems. And that's the only way that we can often get people the help that they need, right? So if a diagnosis is required, as it very often is in the US in particular, but in particular contexts in Canada too and other places, you know, I will do that, and I do it in the most harm reduction way, if that makes sense. So, you know, someone might technically meet the criteria for 8 different DSM diagnoses, but I am most certainly not going to diagnose them with all of that. If they have a history of trauma, they are and they meet the criteria, they're getting a diagnosis of PTSD, right? I don't see the purpose or helpfulness of putting on all these other diagnoses, because again, you know, to me, the DSM is so strongly intertwined with colonialism and with colonial notions and theories of normality. Whereas, you know, historically, and this is where my dissertation is really cool, because a lot of those knowledge holders talked about this. Historically, certain diagnoses that we see today, like, well, none of them existed, right? But even something like Down syndrome, for instance, that was something in my dissertation a couple knowledge holders specifically mentioned and said, like, traditionally in our communities, people who were born with what today gets labeled as Down syndrome, they were just simply seen as people who have this incredible gift for unconditional love. and who are not as much in their ego and don't experience the same fear and greed and, you know, those aspects of the ego. And so they were, you know, considered very gifted teachers in the community because everyone else in the community learned from them about unconditional love, about play and joy. And so just a very different perspective, right? So with the DSM, it's really centered around this one particular worldview that says, well, this is a disorder because you cannot work in a capitalist system. And so it's very interconnected with capitalism. It's more and more, we're seeing how it's interconnected with big pharma. And so as far as actually, like I say, making diagnoses, it's taking that approach of harm reduction. Like Eduardo Duran talks about diagnosis as a naming ceremony, and it's powerful, right? Even in the story, iskotew being called crow woman by other people. I don't know how many people picked up on that subtle thing in there. That's a label, right? She's suddenly labeled and that's who she is. And I've seen it before. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, even Western psychology talks about that. But Duran talks about diagnosis as a naming ceremony because we take on that spirit of that pathology, of that deficit. And so that's one piece of it. When working with those providers, you know, I still just have that, this is trauma, right? Like that's what's at the heart of this, if that's what it is. And they can, you know, just kind of like figure it out that way. But if I have the opportunity to advocate and to work with those providers, I will explain this to them and actually talk about the collective self in relation, you know, actually talk about like, this person is not messed up. This person does not have 8 mental illnesses. This person has experienced a lifetime of trauma, you know, and that's what's happening here. That's why we're seeing what looks like 8 mental illnesses to the DSM, you know, so it's really deconstructing that with them and doing that work with them, but then also ensuring that with the people we're working with, the OKOKO or the Manidu, the people we're helping them understand that this is the usefulness of these diagnoses, right? This is why you're having this diagnosis on your records, because we need this for you to access these services. It does not mean that you have a mental illness. You are basically well, right? So that work on that side is really important so that people don't take that on, because I've seen it before where people have internalized whatever diagnosis was given to them as basically just like a disease, like they're done. I've had people say to me before, I can't because of my trauma, you know, like this is not a possibility in my life, right? So they come to see themselves in that deficit narrative. So I hope that answers. Sorry, it was a bit of a long answer, but that's like, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there.
I think that was a wonderful answer and it makes a lot of sense. And I really like the symptoms as messages and just the transparency that comes with that. Just being, it was just so simple in that you talk to them about it. You just don't write a report and not explain it to them type of thing. So thank you for that. We have a question from Badejo and he's asking, sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. He's saying, very interesting and intellectually stimulating lecture. How does the Indigenous focused oriented therapy demystify the evidence for neurochemical and endocrinology deficits associated with the etiology of Western pathologized experience? So very complicated little question there, but.
Yeah, so our understanding from an Indigenous perspective is not, you know, whether it's like looking at neurochemistry or hormones or whatever you might be looking at, that all of that is interconnected to the whole and interconnected to the web of relationships. And so we don't understand that from an Indigenous perspective as like this person's brain has this fault or has this deficit. That brain, that neurobiology is interconnected with all of the universe and all of creation, right? And the beautiful thing is that we actually have a lot of Euro-Western science that is catching up to Indigenous knowledges, right? We're seeing it. So even, you know, that there was those studies that were coming out that one article I mentioned was based on, But when epigenetic research started to show like, oh, hey, trauma gets passed through DNA, right? Like, you know, there's a way to look at that through a deficit lens, but there's a way to look at that through an Indigenous perspective of like, whoa, everything's passed through DNA, because it is. It's just that the researchers are focusing on deficits because that's what we're taught to focus on from a colonial framework. It's a scarcity mindset, and it's a scarcity worldview that focuses on scarcity, right? Versus Indigenous perspectives come from an approach of abundance and looking at what is there and what is present. And so, you know, like it's not either or either from an Indigenous perspective. The Indigenous acknowledges all. So again, we see neuroscience research that shows how mirror neurons function, right? Like we are connected, we just are. That shows that we, you know, I can be sitting here in Calgary and I can connect to Lake Superior, to Gitchigami in Minnesota, and my brain will show that. My brain, parts of my brain will light up as though I'm sitting there on the shores of Gitchigami, right? So, so again, it would be not like even Euro-Western science shows that our neurobiology is not only our neurobiology. It is not just the individuals. And so, yes, we may see certain things show up in there, right? Of course, there's trends about serotonin and dopamine and what's happening, but that doesn't mean that that started just all of a sudden one day, the neurotransmitters were like, we're not going to release enough of this. Right? Or sorry, the dendrites we're not going to release enough neurotransmitter, right? Or that they weren't gonna you know, all of those things. It's like out of my brain right now, speaking of brains. But you know, it's interconnected with the universe and all of the world, and we see that. We see changes in neurobiology and neurochemistry based on different experiences in the world, and research that's starting to be done that looks at how land changes our brains and our hormones and stuff like that, right? So again, we have these Indigenous wisdoms from across the world that know about holistic wellness, that know about living in harmony. And unfortunately, what Euro-Western research does is it isolates, it reduces, and it breaks down. So one study is going to look at this tiny little particle size worth of what that's about. And so all of that research needs to be taken into the context of everything else and of the research that's showing, oh yeah, like this is affected. We see, you know, dopamine and serotonin releases differently when we're with different people, when we're in different contexts, when we're in different places. So yeah, it's, as far as the answer to that question, it's still totally interconnected. There's no way to isolate a human brain from any experience, because even if you put someone in a sensory deprivation chamber, they're still having an experience that's going to elicit. There's no way to fully experimentally control a human being. So I hope that answers that question.
Oh, definitely. And I think it makes a lot of sense what you can't isolate, and it kind of comes down to what you're taught from the get-go in Psych 100, that correlation is not causation type of thing. So I think we have time for one more question, Rochelle. Yeah, one. Okay. We have one from Jennifer Fuentes, and I'm not actually familiar with this issue, but she says that with all the pretend Indian talk going around, how do we support folks that come from adoption and are not sure about their cultural ties, clans, or tribes? What medicines can we encourage without appropriation?
That's a good question. Yeah, because there's a few different, and is this question in the chat? Because I kind of want to look at the wording.
Yes, I read it verbatim, but yes, it is in the chat. It's a bit further up, but
I found it. Okay. Yeah, so that's a good question. And the pretend Indian thing is a big thing that's going on. You know, and I've known a lot of people who've been on the receiving end of those kind of attacks. And so that's kind of like, I don't see that as much as connected to like the medicine stuff. Because that's kind of a, okay. So I'm gonna tackle this from a few different angles. I'm gonna start with the medicine first. So as far as somebody sensing into what medicine they need for what they're experiencing, that is a human thing. That does not require any particular tribal affiliation or indigeneity. Like any person of any culture of any land in the world has access to their own medicine and their own inner knowing, right? So you don't have to be an Indigenous person, for instance, to sense into like, I just need to go outside and lay on the ground and let what I'm experiencing go into the ground. We all, as I mentioned at the beginning, we all have a connection with land that's completely unavoidable. We are 70% water and the rest of us is made up of land, right? Plants, animals, all of these things that help us to exist in the physical world. And so as far as connection with land and following the medicines, like in my perspective, there's not any particular appropriation that can happen there because we all have a relationship with land, regardless of where we're from. That's not tied to culture. Now, moving into like cultural medicines, like if someone's feeling, like I need a sweat or I need a particular smudge or something like that, in my experience so far, those medicines typically are going to emerge with people who have that lineage, right? Or if they don't, they have that relationship to those teachings. Like I have yet to come across a person, for instance, who does not have Indigenous heritage, who does not have relationship with community, whose medicine that came through would be like, I need to go have a sweat, right? I haven't experienced that yet. I guess it could happen, right? It's also not up to me, and I'm not an authority on that, on who receives teachings or who participates in ceremony. Like that's all very specific, right? And so I see like the pretend Indian or the pretend Indian issue as kind of like something that's like beside this. Because again, there are people who appropriate Indigenous identities and they are not Indigenous and they are using it for a purpose, or maybe they're appropriating medicines. I've seen that before, right? People who are selling workshops on like medicine wheel teachings or whatever, and they're not Indigenous. Like that is absolutely not okay. That I haven't seen in this work that I do, right? It hasn't come out yet. I do work with a lot of non-Indigenous students that I'm sharing this information with. And there's also a lot of non-Indigenous learners that take Indigenous focusing oriented therapy and stuff like that. And so even when I'm working with clinicians and saying, like you need to have in my context, right, in a Plains context, you need to have a smudge available if somebody wants to smudge. Then there's this question, well, what if we don't have an Indigenous person there to help guide that, right? This is where things get, I don't know, like, I guess a little bit sticky, but not really, because it's really about relationship and it's about mentorship, right? Like, I've worked with some incredible allies, who are therapists that work for Indigenous organizations, and they smudge every single day. They go to ceremony, they learn the teachings, they've been given those teachings. And if there is not an Indigenous person around in a moment that someone is coming and saying, they're working with an Indigenous person as a okay or a manidu, and that person is saying, I need a smudge. And that non-Indigenous person is the only one there and they know how to smudge. But that Indigenous person has never smudged before, but they know they need that. It's like, then I say, is it better? Again, we have to look at these like ethics of relationality, right? That person knows how to smudge. They can say, I'm not Indigenous. I've learned how to smudge from this elder. This is the person that taught me. I smudge every day. It helps me. I can share with you how I was taught, but this isn't my lineage, right? And having all of that in there, and then sharing it because that person's asking for it and they need it. And so I think that there's really, like, this gets into a much bigger complex discussion about the ways that allies can get into this work in a good way. But that's where I think it's so important for us to to have those conversations, to listen to the elders and the knowledge holders on these conversations and these teachings, because different people have different teachings. And if someone's elder and mentor is sharing something with them and is sharing this with a non-Indigenous provider and saying, take this into your work, help people with this, then that's not for me to say that they should or shouldn't, right? That's that person's relationship, but just to be sure that they qualify it. And I think that's what's important about this pretend Indian or the pretendian thing, is people just need to be honest about who they are, and those, like when you talk about those who are coming from adoption or who are not sure about those connections, again, we don't want to discourage that connection or disrupt that connection, because that's just a very colonial thing, right? So yeah, I mean, that whole issue is just it's such a challenge, because there are real pretendians out there and they do harm and it's not okay. And there are a lot of people who are not pretendians, who are, Indigenous people that have it's colonialism that's disconnected us, right? And this whole issue of who is or isn't Indigenous enough is a completely colonial construct. If someone is coming from adoption or coming from a place where they were raised without connection to their culture, but they have that lineage, I really supporting them, because we need all of our people. We don't want to participate in genocide by shutting some of our people out and telling them, they're not enough. So I don't know, complex issue though. I think it's a much bigger conversation, but a good question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And yes, we had time for a little question, but it was little did you know, Shireen, you were asking a big one. So really, I'm very, very thankful for that question and for the answering, for the sharing throughout. This has been so important and valuable, and it's really the kind of work that we hope to do through the work of the committee. So on behalf of the IRC and the department, really would like to thank you, but also to everybody who came and attended, took the time to join the event. And really, it's an important time for all of us to come together, listen and engage and learn as part of the work towards reconciliation, a reconnection, resurvivance. So I look forward to seeing you again. So for goodbye to everybody, ekosipitama for the main group, and for the smaller group, the Indigenous students who pre-registered will go to the other link. So thank you again, and see you again.